Okay, so for all of you out there who, like me, spend way too much time thinking about, the really big questions, the nature of reality, and all that fun stuff, well, today we're going to tackle a concept that's kind of at the heart of all that philosophical, heavy lifting information. I mean, we throw this word around constantly, but have we ever really stopped to think about what it actually means? Like, what happens when we apply the rigor of logic to this seemingly simple idea of information?
Yeah, that's a great point. And for anyone with a philosophical bent, it should be pretty clear right off the bat that we're not talking about like the latest news headlines or some fleeting bits of data. We're going deeper than that. What we're after is a grasp of how contemporary logic, in its quest to understand the world, really grapples with this idea of information as a core concept.
Right. We're not just making this up as we go along, are we? We've got some serious philosophical firepower backing us up here.
Oh, absolutely. Our guide for this deep dive is none other than the Logic and Information entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's a pretty dense read, but it's packed with insights from some of the top minds in the field. Think of it as like a detailed map of this whole landscape of logic and information.
A map, huh? That's a good analogy. So, what are the major landmarks, the key destinations we're aiming for on this journey?
Well, the entry lays out three primary philosophical stances on information that have emerged within contemporary logic. And our goal in this deep dive is to really unpack these stances, to explore the different ways logic can help us make sense of this concept that honestly probably plays a huge role in all your philosophical ponderings, whether you realize it or not.
Three stances then. Okay, that gives us a good framework to work with. So where do we start? What's the first stop on our logical tour of information?
All right, let's kick things off with information as range. So the central idea here, and this should resonate with anyone interested in, modal logic, epistemology, all that good stuff, is that the information we have, the information we possess, can be understood in terms of the possibilities that it rules out. It's like an informational state sort of defines a certain range of possibilities that are still on the table, given what we know.
So it's not about like accumulating more and more isolated facts, but rather about kind of shrinking the space of what could be true. It's like we're whittling down the set of possible worlds and narrowing down the options.
Exactly. You got it. And that leads us to a pretty fundamental principle here, the inverse range principle. Basically, it says that the more informative a statement is, the fewer possibilities it allows, and as a result, the less probable it might seem at first glance. Like, a very specific claim is inherently riskier to make. But if it turns out to be true, it's a lot more informative than just saying something super vague in general.
Right. That makes sense. A very specific claim is going to rule out a whole bunch of other possibilities. It's like putting all your chips on one number on the roulette wheel, high risk, high reward. Can you give us like a real world example to kind of illustrate this connection between information and ruling out possibilities?
Sure. So there's this classic scenario that logicians love to use involving Van Bentham's waiter.
Oh.
Okay. So the waiter gets an order for an espresso and a soda, but they don't know which drink is for which customer. So initially, you've got two possibilities, right? Then you, one of the customers, say, hey, the soda is for me. Now, that single piece of information just completely eliminates one of those possibilities. Boom, just like that. The waiter's uncertainty is reduced, and they can logically deduce that the espresso must be for the other person.
I see. So just like that, one little statement changes the whole game. And the way we use language, the words we choose, it's all about kind of manipulating those informational options. Like we're sculpting the space of possibilities with our words.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to put it.
Now, the entry also talks about this distinction between hard and soft information. And I'm guessing this isn't about like how difficult the information is to understand, right?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
The distinction here really hinges on how the information is stored, how it's represented. Okay, so hard information, the defining feature is that it's factive. So if you have it, it's got to be true. And crucially, it's not really subject to revision. You can think of it as aligning with like a very strong notion of knowledge. Soft information, on the other hand, well, it's not necessarily true, and it can change if new evidence comes along. It's kind of more like belief, philosophically speaking. So the key difference is this revisability, how susceptible the information is to being updated or changed.
So, like, if I believe it might rain later today, that's soft information because the forecast could totally change. But if I look outside and see the sun shining right now, assuming my eyes aren't deceiving me, that would be considered hard information, at least for the moment.
Right. Exactly. You nailed it.
Okay, cool. Now, how does all this talk about hard and soft information actually play out in, like, formal logical systems? How do we capture these ideas in a rigorous way?
All right, so this information as range perspective really finds a natural home in epistemic logic. And epistemic logic, as the name suggests, is specifically designed to model knowledge and belief in a formal way. When it comes to hard information, epistemic logic explores how an agent's set of possible worlds, the worlds that are consistent with what they know, shrinks as they get more and more information.
So going back to our waiter friend, initially their knowledge included two possible scenarios: soda for you, espresso for the other person, or vice versa. And then your statement about the soda, it basically zaps one of those worlds out of existence. Only the actual state of affairs remains. Now, how does epistemic logic actually formalize this process of eliminating possibilities?
Okay, so it uses this really important concept called an accessibility relation between possible worlds. So for an agent to know something, for them to know a proposition, that proposition has to be true in all the worlds that are like indistinguishable from their current world, given what they know. So before you said anything, the worlds where you have the soda and the worlds where your companion has the soda were both accessible, like indistinguishable to the waiter, based on just the initial order.
And that's where those modal operators for knowledge come in, right? Like that case symbol we see all the time. It basically means that an agent knows something, if that thing is true, in all the possible worlds they can access, all the worlds that are consistent with their knowledge.
Precisely. And basic modal logic for knowledge gives us these axioms, these fundamental principles. Like axiom A1 says that if you know something and you know that thing implies something else, then you also know that second thing. It's like knowledge is closed under implication, you know. And then there's A2, which states that all those tautologies, all those logically true statements, well, you automatically know them.
Okay, that makes sense. If I know that all bachelors are unmarried, and I know that John is a bachelor, then I automatically know that John is unmarried. But wait a minute, doesn't this run into that whole problem of logical omniscience? Like the idea that if I know a few basic facts, I suddenly know all the infinite logical consequences of those facts? That doesn't really seem to match up with how we humans actually think, does it?
Yeah, you've hit on a major point of contention in epistemic logic. These basic axioms, they describe an idealized reasoner, someone with like infinite cognitive capacity who can instantly grasp all the implications of their knowledge. But we humans, we've got limits, right? We don't just automatically know every single thing that logically follows from what we know. And this gap between the ideal and the real is a huge area of ongoing research and debate in epistemic logic.
It makes sense that we'd need to account for our human limitations somehow. It's like comparing a perfect calculator to a messy, distracted human trying to do math in their head. Okay, so the single agent model gives us a good starting point, but information rarely exists in a vacuum, does it? Out in the real world, we're constantly sharing information, communicating, trying to figure out what other people know. So how does logic handle these more complex social scenarios?
Right, so that's where multi-agent epistemic logic comes in. This framework lets us deal with things like, group knowledge. So we can express things like everybody in the group knows that, which is basically just saying that each individual in the group knows. But it gets more interesting when we talk about common knowledge. Common knowledge is a much stronger condition because it's not just that everyone knows something, but everyone knows that everyone knows it, and everyone knows that everyone knows that everyone knows it, and so on and so on. It's like this infinite nesting of awareness.
Whoa, that's kind of mind-boggling. It sounds like common knowledge is way more powerful than just everyone individually knowing something. But why? What's the big deal with this infinite nesting of awareness?
Okay, so there's this classic example that really drives the point home. The spy example. Imagine you've got a bunch of spies, and they each know that a secret is hidden in a specific envelope. Now, if they only individually know this, if they don't know that the other spies also know this, they're probably going to be pretty cautious, right? They'll keep acting all sneaky and covert. But what if it becomes common knowledge that the secret is in the envelope? Like, what if everyone knows, and everyone knows that everyone knows, and so on? Well, the whole situation changes. Now they can all act more openly because they know they're all in on it. This kind of shared awareness, this common knowledge, it's crucial for understanding things like cooperation, trust, strategic interactions, all these things that are at the heart of social epistemology and like game theory.
That spy analogy is really helpful. I can see how that extra layer of mutual awareness, that common knowledge, completely changes the dynamics of the situation.
Okay, so epistemic logic, as we've been discussing it so far, seems to give us like a snapshot of what agents know at a given moment. But information is always flowing, right? Our knowledge is constantly changing as we get new information. How does logic handle this dynamic, ever-evolving aspect of information?
Right, so that's where dynamic epistemic logic, or DEL, comes into play. And one of the most important frameworks within DEL is public announcement logic, or PAL. So DEL basically takes epistemic logic and adds in actions, things like announcements, observations, even private messages that can change the knowledge of the agents involved. Like when proposition is publicly announced, it's like all the possible worlds where that proposition isn't true just get deleted from the picture.
Oh, I see. So a public announcement is like a knowledge bomb that reshapes the entire landscape of possibilities for everyone involved. And PAL gives us the tools to analyze those changes, right? Exactly. And it does this through, like, reduction axioms, which show how formulas with announcements can be translated back into regular epistemic logic. So you can take a statement about what someone knows after an announcement and kind of break it down into what they knew before and how the announcement relates to what they knew. It's really elegant.
And what about situations where information isn't public, like when people are whispering secrets or passing notes under the table? Can DEL handle that kind of stuff?
Oh, absolutely. DEL is powerful enough to model situations involving private communication or observation. It can capture those scenarios where some agents learn something while others are left in the dark. And this adds a whole other layer of complexity because now the agents have to reason not only about what's true in the world, but also about who knows what and who said what to whom. It gets pretty intricate, but it gives us a way to model those subtle dynamics of knowledge and belief in groups.
Wow, it's amazing how logic can capture these really nuanced aspects of how we handle information in the real world. It's like we're taking these everyday things like rumors and secrets and giving them a precise mathematical representation. Now, this information as range perspective, it also has a quantitative side to it, right? It seems like we should be able to measure information in some way.
Yes, definitely. While those qualitative logical frameworks we've been talking about provide like a really solid conceptual foundation, there's also this whole tradition that goes back to like the inverse range principle that tries to quantify information, to actually assign numbers to it. And classical information theory, which was pioneered by Claude Shannon, that's where a lot of this work comes from.
Yeah.
It takes a mathematical approach focusing on like how much uncertainty is reduced when a signal is transmitted from a sender to a receiver. But it's really important to remember that Shannon's theory is primarily syntactic and static. It's really all about the efficient transmission of signals, not so much about the meaning of those signals or how that meaning changes over time.
Right. So Shannon's theory is about bits, about the capacity of channels, rather than the philosophical significance of the message being transmitted. It's like focusing on the pipes rather than the water flowing through them.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And within that framework, logical truths, those statements that are always true no matter what, they actually have an information measure of 0. And that often feels kind of counterintuitive because philosophically we definitely feel like we're gaining something when we deduce a new logical consequence from what we already know. So Barhel and Carnap, they recognized this tension and they came up with this term psychological information to try to capture the subjective sense of informativeness that we get through deduction.
Interesting. So have there been attempts to like measure this psychological information within the framework of information as range? Can we quantify that feeling of, aha, I just learned something new, even when it's just a logical deduction?
Yeah, there have been some attempts. Hintika's work on surface and depth information was one of the big ones. It was specifically designed to account for the informativeness of deduction. But one of the limitations of his approach was that, well, lots of valid deductions still ended up with an information measure of 0. More recently, Floridi's concept of strongly semantic information has been gaining traction. It basically says that for something to be informative, it has to genuinely narrow down the set of possible worlds. It has to actually rule some things out. And both tautologies and contradictions, they fail to do that, so they're not considered informative in this framework.
Okay, so that gives us a pretty thorough grounding in this information as range perspective. We've seen its logical side, its quantitative side, all the philosophical debates it sparks. It's a lot to think about. Now let's shift gears and dive into the second major stance. Information as correlation. What's the core idea here?
All right, so information is correlation. The focus here shifts away from possibilities and towards connections. It's all about those systematic, reliable connections that exist within structured environments. So the basic idea is that one part of a system can carry information about another part if there's like a stable law-like relationship between them. Think about like the rings of a tree. They can tell us about the age of the tree, the climate it experienced, all that stuff, because there's this inherent connection between those rings and the tree's history. Or, the patterns of stars in the night sky. They can give us information about our location, the time of year, all because of the predictable relationships between those celestial objects and our little corner of the universe.
So it's not just about accumulating facts in isolation, but about understanding how those facts are interconnected within a system. It's like those connections themselves are a form of information.
Precisely. And while Shannon's work definitely touched upon communication through correlated signals, the logical approach, and this is where situation theory comes in, it really dives into the qualitative nature of this information link. Like, what specific information about some distant part of a system can we reliably extract by observing a more accessible part? It's all about understanding those relationships, those correlations.
Okay, so situation theory is the main tool we use to explore this information as correlation perspective. What are like the key concepts and tools that it gives us?
So situation theory kind of grew out of these philosophical inquiries into the mind and language. It's got two main components. First, you've got these rich set theoretic frameworks that are used to build detailed ontologies, ways of representing specific kinds of information within a given context. And then second, you've got this mathematical theory of information flow, which is based on the idea of lawful connections or constraints between different types of situations.
Ontologies. That's a pretty heavy philosophical word. It's like the study of being, of what exists, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And situation theory really gets into the nitty-gritty of representing the different kinds of things that exist and how they relate to each other in the context of information flow. So the basic building blocks are things like individuals, which are like specific objects, relations, which are like properties and connections between individuals, locations, which can be spatial or temporal, and then, really importantly, situations and infons.
Okay, hold on, slow down a bit. What are situations and infons? Those sound important.
They are. So a situation, you can think of it as a specific kind of bounded part of the world, like a particular event, a scene, something like that. And infant, on the other hand, it's a basic unit of information. It basically represents whether a specific relation holds between particular individuals at certain locations.
All right, so if we've got a situation like Mary buys cheese at the market at 10 a.m. today, that's our plus, then an infant would be something like Mary bought cheese, which would be true in that situation.
Exactly. That's a great example. But an infant like Mary did not buy cheese would be false in that situation. And an infant like Armstrong landed on the moon, well, that would also be false because Armstrong isn't even part of that particular situation. It's like the infant has to be about the stuff that's actually going on in the situation. And a really cool thing about situation theory is that it lets us talk about situations even if we don't know every little detail about what's happening in them. We can still reason about those situations even with partial information.
That's really useful. It's like in the real world, we rarely have perfect, complete information about anything. Okay, now what about type abstraction? How does that fit into all this?
Right, so type abstraction, it's this really crucial mechanism for generalizing. It lets us go from specific situations and infons to more general types. So, like, from that specific situation of Mary buying cheddar at the market, we can kind of zoom out and talk about the type of situation where someone buys some kind of cheese at some location. This lets us talk about patterns and regularities across different situations. It's like we're building a more abstract, generalized picture of the world.
Okay, so situations and infons are our ingredients, and type abstraction lets us categorize those ingredients to create broader categories. Now, how does information actually move around within this framework? How does it flow?
Okay, so information flow in situation theory is all about these systematic correlations between types of situations, and these correlations are captured by things called constraints. So a constraint, written like this, P right arrow T, it basically says that whenever you have a situation of type T, there's always this other situation of type T that's connected to it in some way.
Like that radar example you mentioned earlier, where the type of situation is a radar screen showing a blip moving upwards, and that's constrained to the type of situation where a plane is actually moving north because of how radar works.
Yes, exactly. So you could write that constraint as upward moving blip, radar northward moving plane. And this principle of IS verification, it's like the rule book for how we extract information from these constraints. If we see a situation of type T, like that blip moving upwards on the screen, and we know the constraint P right arrow T, and we know those two situations are connected in the right way, then we can infer that we've also got a situation of type T, meaning a plane moving north. And this implication relation, it's transitive, which means that information can flow through chains of constraints without getting lost or distorted. It's like a perfect copy, kind of like Dretske's Xerox principle.
That's really neat how it all links up.
Right.
But as we talked about before, correlations in the real world, they're not always perfect, right? Radars can malfunction, footprints can be misleading. So how does situation theory deal with these potential breakdowns in the information flow?
Yeah, that's a great point. And situation theory acknowledges that those background conditions are super important. Like when we say that T implies, that often depends on a bunch of other things being true, those background conditions. If those conditions aren't met, if the radar is broken or the footprints were faked, then the information link can break down and we can end up with errors. It's like the constraint only holds if the context is right.
Okay, that makes sense. The context always matters. Now, the entry goes on to talk about distributed information systems and channel theory. It sounds like we're moving to an even more abstract level now, away from specific situations and towards more general systems of information.
Right? That's exactly what's happening. Channel theory, it gives us this really powerful way to model information flow in systems where the information is distributed across different parts, different components. And it does this by focusing on how those different parts, which are characterized by how their entities are classified into types, how those parts are interconnected.
So instead of thinking about individual radar screens and planes, we're zooming out and thinking about the general categories of information sources and destinations within a larger system, right?
Exactly. And the key tools here are classifications and infomorphisms. So a classification written like this, Math BFA, Langle instances, types, models wrangle. It formally defines the entities within a part of the system, the types they can belong to, and the relationship between those entities and types. An infomorphism, denoted as right math BFA, right arrow math BFC, it's basically a mapping, a function that preserves structure as it goes from one classification to another. It's a way of connecting those classifications, and it generalizes the idea of a part of relationship.
Okay, so if infomorphisms are the connections between classifications, then they're kind of like the channels through which information flows within a distributed system.
Exactly. It's like they're the pipelines that carry the information.
Can you, connect this back to the radar example? How would we model that using channel theory?
Sure. So in the radar system, we might have a classification called, say, screens, which represents all the possible radar screens and the states they can be in. And then we'd have another classification called planes, which represents all the airplanes and their possible movements. Now, an infomorphism could map the states of the radar screen, which are the instances in the screen's classification, to corresponding situations in a common classification, like monitoring situations. And it would also map the airplane movements, which are instances in the plane's classification, to those same monitoring situations. So this common classification, monitoring situations, it acts as a channel connecting the information about the planes to the readings on the screens.
So it's like we're creating this abstract space where the information from the radar and the information about the planes can come together and be compared. And then channel-enabled signaling, that's the process of actually transmitting the information through those channels, right?
Precisely. It's all based on those connections, those infomorphisms, and the constraints between the types of situations within those connected classifications. It's like we're using the structure of the system itself to guide the flow of information.
That's a really elegant way to think about it. And this whole channel theory approach, it also lets us talk about the local logics that might be used by agents who are only interacting with specific parts of the system, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like an agent who's only looking at the radar screen, they might develop a logic that's perfectly consistent with their observations, but it might be incomplete or even unsound when compared to the logic of an agent who has access to the whole system, who can see the planes directly. It's a really interesting way to think about the limitations of perspective and how that affects our reasoning.
Okay, so that covers information as correlation and all its implications for how we understand knowledge and communication within structured systems. Now let's move on to our third and final stance, information as code. This one seems to be all about how information is represented and manipulated, like the nuts and bolts of information processing.
You got it. So this stance really emphasizes that for information to be used, whether it's by a human mind thinking or by a computer crunching data, it has to be encoded in some form, some kind of symbolic or representational format. And the properties of that encoding, the rules that govern how we can manipulate those symbols, those become the central focus of analysis.
So it's not just about the content of the information itself, but about the form that content takes and how we can mess with that form, how we can process it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, think about how observations become informative. It's not just the raw sensory data hitting our eyes and ears. It's the way our brains encode and interpret that data, how we connect it to our existing knowledge and concepts. Or think about deduction. We get new information through deduction, not because the conclusion is somehow separate from the premises, but because the process of logical inference lets us manipulate the information encoded in the premises in a way that makes the conclusion explicit.
I see. I see. It's like the conclusion is already in there somewhere, but we need to do some processing, some manipulation to actually extract it and make it useful.
Precisely. And this isn't just about human cognition either. This information as code perspective, it also applies to how computers work, how artificial intelligence systems process information. It's relevant to algorithmic information theory, which studies how efficiently we can describe information. It's a really broad and powerful way of looking at things.
So what are some of the specific tools and frameworks that we use to study information as code?
Well, one of the big ones is categorical information theory.
Categorical information theory, huh? That sounds like a mouthful. What's the deal with that?
It's a really cool approach that draws heavily on ideas from linguistics, specifically categorical grammars at the Lambeck calculi. These were originally developed to analyze the syntax of natural language, the rules of grammar. But in categorical information theory, we repurpose these tools to model the cognitive processes that underlie reasoning and information processing. It's like we're taking the tools of linguistics and applying them to the mind itself.
Interesting. So how does that work in practice? Can you give us an example?
Sure. So think back to that IKEA table analogy that we mentioned earlier. You've got all the pieces of the table, the premises, but you don't have a functional table, the conclusion, until you've actually put those pieces together according to the instructions.
Right, right. The instructions are key. Just having the pieces isn't enough. You need to know how to combine them in the right way.
Exactly. And that's what categorical information theory is all about. It uses operations like merge or fusion, symbolized by this little symbol, to represent the combination of pieces of information. And it uses typed function application, symbolized by right arrow and left arrow, to model how information can be used and transformed.
Yeah.
It's like it sees the mind as a kind of database, and the rules of logic and grammar are like the constraints that govern how information can flow and be combined within that database.
Okay, that's a pretty cool way to think about it. So are there any formal rules that govern how these operations work?
Yes, there are. There are these things called residuation conditions, which basically show the logical relationships between these operations. They're kind of like equations that show how merging, function application, and all that stuff fit together. And then to give these syntactic operations meaning, we could use these things called informationalized Kripke frames, which are basically extensions of the possible worlds semantics that we talked about earlier. They introduce the idea of information states, which are like possible worlds, but with more structure. And they have this partial order relation that represents how information can develop over time. And they also have an operation for combining these information states. It gets pretty technical, but it's all about giving a precise mathematical meaning to these operations of information processing.
So we've got the syntax, which is like the rules of the game, and we've got the semantics, which is like the meaning behind the game. It's like we're building a whole formal system for understanding how the mind manipulates information.
Exactly. And a key part of this system is the idea of structural rules. These rules, like weakening, contraction, and commutation, they basically determine the fundamental properties of how information is handled within the system. Like, can we ignore information? Can we reuse it multiple times? Can we change the order in which we process information? These rules determine all that.
So those structural rules, they're like the settings on our information processor. They determine how the whole system behaves.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. And by choosing to either accept or reject these rules, we can create different logics that are sensitive to different aspects of information processing. Like, rejecting the rule of weakening leads to relevant logics, where the information used to derive a conclusion has to be genuinely relevant to that conclusion. You can't just throw in random stuff.
Right, that makes sense. It's like in a relevant logic, every piece of information has to earn its keep, has to contribute to the final result.
Exactly. And then rejecting contraction gives rise to linear logics, where you're really careful about how many times a piece of information is used. It's like you've got limited resources, and you have to be strategic about how you use them. Rejecting commutation means that the order in which you process information matters, which is important for modeling things like temporal sequences or the step-by-step nature of certain tasks. And rejecting association affects how information is grouped and combined.
Wow. So by tweaking those structural rules, we can create all these different logics that are tailored to different kinds of information processing. It's like a whole toolkit for understanding the mind.
It is. And categorical information theory is a really interesting example because it rejects all the structural rules except for weakening. This means it's really focused on the procedural aspect of information, how information is dynamically transformed and manipulated, rather than just the static relationships between premises and conclusions. It's all about the process, the journey, rather than just the destination.
And the entry also mentions Dunn's work on distinguishing between programs and data. How does that fit in with all this?
Right, so Dunn's work is really important because it highlights how this distinction between programs, which are like active processes, and data, which is the stuff those processes operate on, how that distinction interacts with those structural rules we were talking about. It gives us a deeper understanding of what informational relevance means in different computational and cognitive contexts.
This has been a seriously mind-bending deep dive. We've gone from information as range to information as correlation to information as code. It's amazing how many different ways there are to think about this one concept.
It is. And the really cool thing is that these different approaches, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. They often complement each other, providing different perspectives on the same underlying phenomenon. Like the range of possibilities that's consistent with the local information available in a structured system, that's a natural bridge between the range and correlation perspectives. And formally, we can explore these connections using tools like restricted product state spaces and constraint-based models. It gets pretty technical, but it shows how these different approaches can be integrated.
And what about the connection between information as code and information as correlation? How do those fit together?
So the link there becomes clear when we think about information channels, those things we were talking about in situation theory. Those channels, they're actually a specific type of information carrying structure, a way of representing conditional information. And researchers like Restall and Mayers, they've shown how Barwise's channel theoretic framework can be formally represented within the information as code paradigm using substructural logics, especially relevance logic. It's really cool how it all ties together.
And finally, what about the connection between information as code and information as range?
That's one of the hottest areas of research right now. People are really working hard to bring those two perspectives together. One way they're doing that is by developing these things called substructural epistemic logics, which try to combine the dynamic aspect of DEL, how knowledge changes over time, with the procedural focus of categorical information theory, how information is processed step by step. And another really important direction is to introduce explicit syntactic representations of code of those information structures into the information as range framework. This lets us get a much more fine-grained understanding of how knowledge and belief evolve through these computational and cognitive processes.
So it's like we're taking the best of both worlds and combining them to create an even more powerful framework for understanding information.
Exactly, that's the goal.
And the entry also briefly mentions some more.